Welcome back to the Suffolk Sewing Circle Essential Skills series. This is part 4 where we're going to give you an orientation to everything you need to know to install a zipper. So we're going to talk about the different types of zippers, the feet that you would use to install them, and give you a demonstration for how to put them together. Thank you for coming today, and we hope that it's a helpful learning experience.
So we're going to talk about the different parts of a zipper so that throughout the tutorial, as I make reference to those, it's really clear. And we're going to use our slot zipper here as our example. And so you can see here that we have an upper stop, we have an upper stop and a lower stop. The pieces that the zipper attaches with are called the zipper tape. This is going to be our zipper pull, and this is going to be our coil here in the middle, the metal part. If I unzip it and we see them separately, these are called teeth. And so it's teeth when it's separated, it's the coil when it's together, and both of those things are the same. We want to be careful when we're using our zippers, if we have to do any pressing throughout, that we're pressing mostly on our zipper tape, that we're not putting our iron on top of our coil, because that can melt our coil and that would ruin our zipper. So be mindful of that. Sometimes the coil is metal, sometimes it's plastic. It really varies depending on the type of zipper. And then your zipper pull is going to vary too, depending on whether it is decorative or more utilitarian. And so zippers are going to really vary from one type to another.
Okay, so first we're going to go over a couple of different types of zippers that we're going to talk about in this video today. And so this one here is a slot zipper. Typically you would install it in a slot of a garment or a project, and that's why it's called that. And this is the kind that has a stopper on the end, so you're going to have to install it in a way that it's already gathered at the end. So we'll talk about how to prepare your project for that type of zipper when we get to that part. This one here is an invisible zipper, and so they call it that because you can see here the tape is covering the coil here. And so on your garment, you would only see this zipper pull here, and it would cover up that. It also has the stop at the end. So just like the slot zipper, it has to come together on your project. So we'll talk about that one. And then the third type we have here is a separating zipper. And so this one is going to show on your garment or your project. Typically it's going to be on something like a jacket where you'd want to zip it and have it separate. I've also seen this on skirts and other garments like that, and also on bags and other things of that type. And so when you unzip this, you actually can separate it at the bottom, and it's on two different pieces. And so that's why it's called a separating zipper. And so then you just line it up like that to zip it back. And so we're going to talk about how to install all three kinds of zippers in this video.
So these are some different feet for your sewing machine that you would use when you're installing zippers. And I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of the different types. And so this one here is going to be sort of your standard zipper foot. And you can see here that it has a little spot on either side for your needle. It's designed so that your stitch will be right beside the teeth on your zipper. And like I said, you could use this on either the right or the left side of the zipper. Another option that you can use if you don't have a zipper foot particularly is a narrow foot like this one. This isn't technically a zipper foot, but I have used it for zippers before because, as you can see, you can still get quite close to the edge of your zipper teeth. So this would be an alternative that you could use if you don't have a zipper foot. Even though a lot of times a zipper foot will come with a sewing machine just as a standard foot. This one here is an adjustable zipper foot. So if you're interested in having one that's a little bit easier to use, I recommend looking into picking up one of these. You can order those online if they're not available at a local store. What's nice about these is that they're very adjustable, and so it has this little screw on the top back here, and then as you loosen it, you can see I can move it a little bit from one side to another. And so this is if I wanted it on this side here, and I can make it as close to or as far away as I need it to. So this part would be attached to my sewing machine, and this is the part that would move here. So that's a nice option as well. And then these other two here are different kinds of invisible zipper feet. And so they are designed so that when you're sewing your invisible zipper that we're going to demonstrate here later in the video, that the groove on the bottom of the foot catches the coil, and so it'll make sure that it's right up against your zipper coil. And so this is a metal one, this is a plastic one, so there's different kinds. Sometimes you'll find that the plastic feet are more non-stick, so that can be helpful. If you have some fabric that wants to catch on a metal foot, you can always use a plastic foot instead. So first we're going to go over how to install a separating zipper, because this is probably the easiest one to do. And so as you can see here, it separates into two pieces, and we're going to install it just like that. And so for that reason, I have my fabric here that's cut into two pieces, and I have it pinned ahead of time so that we have an equal amount on each side that's folded under. And typically in a garment or project that uses this kind of zipper, you would have a facing here, which is the extra piece that is attached for stability to make it sturdy enough for your zipper. We're going to pretend like we have a facing by just folding under the fabric here. This is just for practice, and so this isn't how you would really install a zipper most likely, but just for practice this should work. And so I've pinned it here, like I said, equal on both sides. So I would begin by pressing it to make sure that it's folded under nicely. And so just give it a good press. Make sure that you've got a good edge there to attach your zipper. Right. And then I'll press this side as well. And you'll notice that I've used my dressmaker pins. These are metal, so there's no plastic pieces on them that are going to melt. That's going to be an important part of your project construction here. Okay. So now that this is pressed, I'm ready to take all my pins out. I want to be sure not to run over those with my sewing machine. If you sew over your pins, you run the risk of breaking a needle, and that's dangerous for your machine. It's dangerous for you as well. You don't want any pieces of needles going flying anywhere. That could be a hazard. So just to keep that in mind. Looks like that wants to come up just a little bit. So I'm going to give it one more good press. Make sure that stays put for us. Oops. I'll do the same here just to be sure. And then likewise, I'm going to do the same on each end. So pretend like this would be the top of our garment, for example. So of course you would have a closed seam here. So we'll pretend like that's one end and then another end like this. of course that's going to be plenty long enough for our zipper here. Here I have pinned on my zipper ready to sew. And so before we pressed everything ready, and now that we have it pinned, it would be ready to sew. So with this, I did do my pins going the direction of the zipper, and that's because if you pin it crossways, like you would do a lot of other trim, that's going to make it kind of lumpy with the teeth of the zipper here. So I do recommend that you do them up and down. The other thing is you want to do them pointing in the direction that you're going to stitch so that you can take them out as you go. If I had pinned it going the other direction because I'm going to feed it through going this way, I would have an awkward job trying to pull my pins out, and so you want to make it easy to pull those out as you go. The other thing I want to point out about the way that I pinned it is that I gave just a little bit of fabric here on the edge, so about the width of a stitch. So it doesn't make it so that the teeth hang over the edge. You want to make sure that there's fabric underneath there. And that is so that when you zip your garment together, that the pieces of the fabric touch each other underneath the zipper teeth. So before we get started sewing our separating zipper, I just want to demonstrate a little bit about this specialty foot that I have here. So this is my adjustable zipper foot, and this lets me sew on either side. And so as you can see here, I have it adjusted to sew on this side. So I have it adjusted so that my needle goes right in this slot here. But if I wanted to, for example, sew on the other side of a zipper, I could undo this screw and I could slide it over. And again, you just kind of test it out to make sure your needle doesn't hit it like this, because that's a problem, of course. But you can adjust it like this, get it about where you think it'll work, and tighten it again. And you can see I can sew on that side as well. So that's a handy tip about these adjustable feet. So now we're going to sew on our first side of our separating zipper. And remember that when you're starting your zipper, and this is a good tip for any kind of sewing, you want to make sure that you back stitch, because that's what's going to tie a knot, so to say, and make sure that your stitches don't come loose. And so the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell my sewing machine to stop with my needle down. That way, if I want to pivot at all, then I can do that without losing my spot where I am. And so the first thing I'm going to do is sew the outside edge of my zipper tape here, where it would lay down on the garment. I'm going to take out my pins as I go so as not to run over them with my sewing machine. And I'm using a contrasting thread so that you can see what I'm doing really clearly. And of course, in a real project, you probably use thread that matches your zipper. But this is good practice to make sure that you're sewing in a straight line. And then just pause to take out your needles as you go, your pins as you go. And you can see that my narrow zipper foot does a good job of staying right beside the teeth there and not getting in the way. A standard foot would be too wide to sew in this narrow space. When you get towards the bottom, make sure that your folded under edge is laying flat so that you don't end up with it crinkled underneath. Okay. And here we are with one side done.
So now that we have anchored our zipper to the garment here, we're gonna go and finish it right along the teeth here. And I've put my foot on the other side now because I don't want it to sit on top of the teeth because that would make it too lumpy. So I want it to hold down what I'm sewing right beside. And so basically I'm gonna have my needle go right next to the teeth, not on top of them, just between the foot and the teeth. Remembering to backstitch when we start. And you can see there I'm running it right next to the teeth, but not on top of it. It's okay to go slow on this part. I'm going to turn my speed down a little bit to make sure. As we get ready to do our second side for our separating zipper, we want to just double check that we have everything lined up correctly. As you can see, we have a directional fabric here that has a pattern, and it's important that we have that pattern matching up, right? Which we do. It's also good to test out your zipper just to double check that you have the right amount of fabric underneath here so that it's not too much and it'll get caught in the teeth. It's also not too little that the fabric doesn't match up, because remember, our goal is that the fabric will match together underneath that zipper just right. So I'm just going to test out my zipper, double check that I have it right, make sure I don't need to make any adjustments, and it zips well. So we're going to go ahead and do our other side. So as we get ready to do our other side here, we know that our zipper pull here is going to get in our way a little bit. So we want to go ahead and unzip it a little ways, and then when we get down to where we've put it, we can move it back where it was. And so just like we did before, we will do the outside first. And remember that I have it set so that my needle will go down when I stop, and this is a good example for why I would do that. And so I've got to move my pull on the other side, and you're going to see that it runs into my foot here. So I'm going to have to actually lift up my foot so that it will let me by. And you have to just kind of wiggle it a little bit. So don't stress if it's a little difficult to move by, that's normal. And now I've moved my pull out of the way and I can keep going. So with the other side, we did our best to keep the bulk of our material out this way as we sewed, but this time, because we have this little stopper here, that's going to pose a little bit of a challenge. And so you can try to sew it this way and it'll be just a little bit in if you want, with sewing kind of around that and then coming a little bit closer to the teeth. If you have a project that does fit so that you can turn it around the other way, that's another option. It just depends on how bulky it would be here, because if you're sewing a jacket or something, it's obviously not going to fit on the other side of your machine. If you're sewing something skinny like we have today, it's okay to turn it around. So that's just a judgment call to make. So for this, I'm actually going to turn it around going the other way. I'm going to leave my foot like it is. Just because that's going to give us the best finish, and we're able to do that this time. So remember to start out back stitching. Don't get too close to your teeth so that you have enough room to sew right in between your foot and the teeth. And now we have our finished zipper. So just to double check that we got it right, you can zip it together. And there you have it, a finished zipper. And doing it this way is a nice statement on any project that you have. You can do similar thread to your zipper, or you can do contrasting thread here as an alternative style. So now we're going to show you how to install an invisible zipper. And so I have one here. And the first thing that we have to do is prepare the zipper for sewing. And so with an invisible zipper, the tape lies on top of it while the coil lies underneath. So this is the bottom side of it. And so because of that, it's going to tend to have the tape roll over the coil, and it makes it hard to stitch right beside it. So what we're going to do is we're going to unzip it, and we're going to press it so that the coil is away from the zipper tape as much as we can. And so again, careful not to put our iron right on top of the coil, because we don't want to melt it, just in case it is a little bit sensitive to heat. I have my iron on just a medium high. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of rolling the coil away from the tape and pressing it out. Careful not to get it on my finger. So just be careful with your iron, but I just sort of fold it out and then press, using sort of the edge of my iron like this. And this will help it lay better while we're getting it attached to our project. And now we'll do the other side. I'm gonna start down here at the bottom. That might make it easier. And that's going to make our zipper tape fold out from the coil a little bit like that. Okay, and so what you're going to want to do next is mark along the opening here, as well as the top and bottom, the 5/8 seam allowance that we're going to use. And it's important for an invisible zipper because you're going to sew your zipper right onto that seam allowance. And so what I'm going to do, since I've just marked it, is I'm going to put my zipper onto that seam allowance, and I'm going to pin it down. So I have pinned on my invisible zipper here, ready to start sewing. And as you can see, I have pinned it right side down along the line that I drew for our seam line. And so as you can see, when I turn this to be right side out again, once I have attached it, then that's going to show up just like it needs to, and it'll be the same on the other side. And so it'll be truly invisible because that line that I drew should be covered by our stitch line. So you can see here I have on my invisible zipper foot, and like I mentioned earlier, this has a nice little track underneath to grab my coil as I sew to make sure that my needle sits right beside the coil without the coil getting in the way. And so I'm going to use that to stitch all the way down right along the seam line that we marked underneath. See, I'm getting down to the end here, so I'm going to stitch as far as I can to the zipper stop and then back stitch to make sure that it's tied off. And we're done with that side.
So now that I have sewn all the way down my zipper, you can see that if I were to turn it like it would be zipped, that this would be the top and our zipper would be pretty much invisible. And so now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, pinning the right side down along our seam line here. So I have zipped up my zipper after pinning it on the other side just to double check that I have lined this up. It's a good thing to start with your zipper zip when you place your first pin, just to be sure that you're on the right track, and to zip it when you're done before you start stitching in case you need to make any adjustments. But since it looks good here, I'll unzip it and we'll get started sewing the other side. So as you can see here, I have pinned it all along the seam line here so that my coil lines up with that, and I'm going to sew it all the way down just like I did the other side. So just like I did before, I will line up one of the grooves with the coil here so that it'll keep track with it and it will stitch my line right up against my coil. All the way down, I'm going to zip it here, and you'll see that it lines up nicely. We've gotten it together there, and so now we just have to close our seam here. And so we've stitched all the way down to the bottom where the zipper stop is. So we have this little tail that we're going to move out of our way, and we're going to just close up that seam, and we're going to stitch it together just as we would on a garment. And so I'm just going to grab a couple pins here, and I'm just going to pin that together just like I would on a project. And I've also switched to my regular zipper foot for this last part because I need to get right up to where I left off stitching with my invisible zipper foot, so that's closed seam here, so that the tail of my zipper ends up inside the seam. And so you can see I have my regular zipper foot ready to go, and I've pulled the tail of my zipper off to the side so it's not in the way. And I'm going to start right where I left off sewing here, and I'm just going to sew right along here on the same seam line there. So I'll go ahead and pull out this first pin so it's not in our way. And also remember to back stitch when you start. So you can see there, we have closed our seam and our zipper is completely concealed. And so the last step will be to press that seam open so that it lays nice and flat. Leaving it like this, it would leave a little bubble here, and we want to make sure it lies flat for our garment. Okay, and so I'm just going to show you how to iron pressing out. And this is a good thing to do with any sort of project construction to make sure that your seams lie just like they're supposed to. And so because our zipper is closed, the coil is protected. I'm not going to melt it in any way by doing this, but I'm just going to kind of press, pulling apart those seams as best I can as I press. And our markings are going to show a little bit, which is why you would never use a permanent line when you're doing this for a real project. But for the purposes of learning how to sew, it's a good practice so you can see how it all comes together. And so if this were a real garment, you can see how much nicer that would look to have it all pressed open and lined flat. That's a much better look than the sort of lumpy look it had before I pressed it.
So now we're going to be installing our slot zipper. And so this is the zipper that has the stopper on the end. And so it has to be closed on the end to be able to hold the bottom of the stopper here. So I've already marked here where we're going to close it. This is going to be the bottom of the zipper, and it will be the zipper here on this part. And so to prepare our opening for our slot zipper, we have to stitch from the bottom down to the hem. And so I'm going to do that here to prepare it to sew. Remember to backstitch as you get started. And so now you can see that this is prepared to sew. If I open it up here, we've got our pretend garment put together and we have our slot ready to go. And so the next thing we're going to have to do to prepare our opening for our zipper is to mark our seam line where we're going to apply the zipper. I've already done this on one side, and remember we're going to use our 5/8 inch seam. And so now I'm just going to mark it on this side using my ruler here. And it's okay to fold the part we've already marked to the side to make that easier as you get ready to mark. And so I'll find my line here on my ruler. Make sure it's lined up all the way down, just the same. And I'm using a regular ballpoint pen here just to show you how to do it and leave my marks there for instructional purposes. Of course, with a regular project or garment, you would want to use one that's disappearing, whether it's an iron off or a washable ink. So there I have my seam line marked. So now the next thing we have to do to prepare our opening for our zipper is to install some interfacing. I have it pre-cut here to be 5/8 inch wide because that's how wide our seam is going to be. And I also have it cut here to be about 2 inches longer than my zipper. And so the purpose of this interfacing is a stabilizer. And so in this use of it, it's going to act as a stay, which is going to firm up this seam for us so that it'll hold on to our zipper better and it'll wear better over time. So it'll keep it from the zipper separating from the garment as you wear it. And so I have this cut ready to go, and remember that the gluey side needs to be towards the fabric, and in this case I'm going to apply it to the back of the fabric, and I'm going to line it up right to the very top and then right along the seam like this. And so to make sure that it's going to stay put once we apply it, I'm going to go ahead and just touch it gently with the edge of my
iron here just to kind of baste it into place. Not too much so that I couldn't wiggle it and move it a little bit if I needed to. And so you can see there, I'm satisfied with how it fits on there now. And so I have my damp cloth here, and this is going to be how we activate the glue on the interfacing. So I'm going to lay this damp cloth over it like this, and I'm going to press it with my iron for about 10 seconds. And you'll hear it sizzle, and that's how you know your iron is hot enough. And so this is just making sure that my interfacing gets nice and securely attached to my fabric, and it'll do its job well. My iron isn't quite long enough to reach all the way to the end, so I'm going to just scoop my cloth up a little bit more and do that one more time to get the other end. All right, and then I check and make sure that it's sealed well. It's a little bit loose, but I think once I press it one more time, it should adhere. See, that side is a little bit too loose. It's okay to give it a little bit more dampness and repress it. That's why we check it and make sure. Any places that seem too loose, we can always repress. Check it and see. And that looks way better. And so now I'm just going to continue to press on it without the cloth, kind of securing that all the way and also pressing out any extra moisture. We don't want it to be wet while we're sewing it. And so I'm just going to continue to press until all the moisture is gone.
So now that we have our interfacing installed here and it's nice and dry and pressed, we're ready to press open our seams where we're going to apply our zipper. And so that's why we have our lines marked here. That helps give us a guide of where to press. And this is an important part of your preparation to sew. So I'm going to just press it open all the way down to where I closed the opening here, making sure it's nice and flat. And then I will do the same on this side, pressing open the opening here. All right, and if we flip it over on the top side, you can see that we are ready for our zipper to close that up for us, and that'll line up really well. So the next step is going to be to key our zipper and our opening so that they line up well when we go to install our zipper. I've gone ahead and marked them here. But you want to mark about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above your zipper, depending on how long your tape is, like this. And so I marked it with my pen so that I can demonstrate for you where to sew. And when I marked it, I opened this up a little bit, kind of lined it up where it's going to sit on the fabric, and use that as a guide for where to mark. So now I'm going to stitch right over those markings so that I have a key line. And so to do that, we're going to come up here, I have my regular foot on my sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch right over this key line here. It's not necessary to back stitch for this one because this is just going to be a temporary stitch here. And so I'm just going to line up this opening here so that my lines come together, and I'm just going to stitch right over that line. You just have to go slow and kind of feed it in. It's okay to rearrange it a little bit as you go. Like I said, this is just to help you line everything up right as you go. And so I have keyed the top of the opening there, you can see. So now I'm going to do the same thing with my zipper that I did with the opening. So to do this for the zipper, where I've marked it here, I'm going to unzip it quite a bit. So that way I can really line up the zipper tape and make a straight line. And just like I did before, I'm just going to slowly and carefully, without back stitching, work my way across that line that I've marked. And it's okay to just do a stitch or two at a time. And I'm just going to lift my foot and make sure I get right up there so my next stitch will be right on the tape. All right, and that should do it. And so to show you how that looks, you can see I have my key line marked on my zipper now. And so you can see with our key lines marked here, that should line up really well. And so just leaving my stitches in as a marker, I'm going to snip this open with my snips here. So if you have your embroidery scissors or something like that, that's fine. So my line stays here for marking. And then I'm going to do the same here and just clip open my key line for my garment. So that's going to be how I line up my zipper with the opening. And so now I will open up my zipper and I would line it up matching my key lines. And this is the part where we have to prepare it to sew. And so one way that you can do this is to pin it. And so I will show you how it would pin on here. Just like we did with our other zippers, we want our pins going in the direction of the coil so we don't have to pin over our coil. But what I'm going to do in addition to pinning it like this is I'm going to go back and baste that on because these pins are going to be quite a bit in our way as we go to install it. So I will pin it this way and I'm going to go back and baste it by hand. To baste it by hand, I will sew a running stitch the length of the zipper, just where my pins are here. A nice long stitch so that it's loose, and I'm not going to tie it off at the end so that I can pull those stitches back out when I'm finished with them. But that way I can test to make sure that my zipper is working like it should, that it's lined up correctly, and that we're ready to sew before we start. And so you can see here that I have basted on my zipper. So now I don't have any pins that are going to get in my way here. You'll also see that I have attached it such that I have a little bit of space from the edge. Just like we did with our first separating zipper, we want to make sure that we don't have our teeth hanging over the seam line here. So it's about a stitch's width, just a little bit, so that the fabric comes together when we're finished. And then you can also see that I left my tails just hanging out. We didn't tie them off like we would for something more permanent. That's so that when I'm finished, I can just pull those out when I'm done with those serving their purpose. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark at the bottom of my zipper here, just about 1/4 of an inch below the zipper stopper here. I'm going to just mark a line where my pivot point is going to be. And it's going to be a little bit hard to see on the video, but this lets me know where I need to turn as I'm stitching my zipper to make sure that I have secured it enough. Again, you would use a disappearing ink in real life, but for practice, it's fine to just use a ballpoint pen. To double check that we have everything right before we start sewing for real, we can zip up our zipper to make sure it lines up like we want, and it does. So this is going to work out really well, and we're ready to get started. And so we'll just unzip. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that with basting, on this side, I went all the way through so you can see it on top. You're welcome to do it that way if you like to keep an eye on that as you sew. If you don't want that in your way and you're worried you'll drive over it, it's okay to just do it through the folded part of the seam here and not have it show on top. Either way is fine. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to sew on the left side here using our zipper foot, which I'm just going to move over so that it sits beside our zipper coil on that side. All right, and so we're going to start up at the top, remembering to back stitch as we get started. With your adjustable foot, it's good to test it out before you get rolling just to make sure that it's not going to be in the way of your needle. As you can see, I had to readjust mine just a little bit. There we go. And that's going to work right there. Excellent. Okay, now we're ready to start. No, we're not ready to start.
Do you want to restart?
No, it's okay. You can let it roll. You can just trim it out if you want. Sorry about that. Our equipment's just being sassy today, huh? Okay. So as we get started, remember to do your back stitching. Our zipper foot is going to help us stay right up next to the coil. And as we get towards the bottom, we're going to want to move our zipper pull so that it's not in our way. So I'm just going to close this zipper. Just kind of wiggle it past our zipper foot there. So it's not going to be in the way. We don't want to have to steer around it because that's going to give us a weird bulge in our seam line. And then just continue working until you get down to where we've marked here. Just like I did on the other side, I've marked it on the top. And we'll pivot around that corner. And so when I get to my line that I've marked, using my needle down, just like I did before, I will just pivot like this. And I will stitch across that pivot line. Just like that. And now you can see we've done one side. And so now I'm going to sew on the other side. This is the right side of my zipper. And I have flipped it upside down to make it easier as I turn around that pivot. And so I'm going to sew it with the back side up this time, remembering to back stitch as I get started. And again, as I get close to the end, I'm going to want to zip my zipper so that that pull isn't going to be in my way. And it's going to be a little tricky to do, so just take your time wiggling it through there. And then we'll continue and we'll turn and pivot around just like we did before on the front side. All right, and now I'm just going to pivot so that it matches the front, just like I did before. Making sure to back stitch as I finish here. So now that we have our zipper installed, we're ready to take out our basting threads. So like I said before, by keeping that not knotted at the end, that should come out really easily. Just use your handy dandy seam ripper to just pull those out. They've done their job, and now we don't need them anymore. So that's a handy thing to do with any sort of construction of projects, is to baste it together, try out the fit, make sure things come together as you want them to. It's also a handy way to do without having to work around pins, especially for tricky things like the coil of a zipper. All right, and so now we see that our zipper is installed. It works like we want it to, and it lines up just right. Thank you again for joining the Suffolk Sewing Circle for this lesson about installing zippers. We hope that you found it helpful. We also want to invite you to join us on Facebook. The Suffolk Public Library has a group attached to its main page called Let's Talk About Handicrafts. If you join us there, we can answer your questions about zippers and continue the conversation after these videos. So we hope to see you there, and happy sewing.